G. A single crop generated more wealth than gold mines and spice routes combined, and it required a labor system so vast it transported 11 million people across an ocean. Sugar didn't just sweeten food, it built the economic architecture of 3 continents and created the Atlantic world as a functioning system. Before the 15th century, sugar was a luxury confined to Mediterranean islands and parts of Asia. Europeans knew it as medicine, preservative, and status symbol, but supply was limited and prices were high. Then Portuguese sailors began planting sugarcane on Atlantic islands off the African coast, Madeira in the 1420s, São Tomé by the 1470s, and the model changed. These islands had volcanic soil, reliable rainfall, and something Europe lacked: empty land that could be reorganized entirely around a single export crop. What made these islands different wasn't just climate, it was distance from European legal systems and the ability to experiment with labor arrangements that mainland societies wouldn't tolerate. But sugarcane presented an industrial problem that grain and livestock did not. The plant had to be harvested within days of ripening, or it lost sucrose content. Once cut, cane had to be crushed and boiled within 48 hours, or the juice fermented and became useless. You couldn't grow sugar with seasonal labor. You needed a workforce that stayed in place, worked through harvest without negotiation, and could be expanded as quickly as new land was cleared. European indentured servants died in tropical heat, fled when contracts ended, and couldn't be legally held for life. Indigenous populations in the Americas collapsed under disease and forced labor. The solution that plantation owners adopted was the Atlantic slave trade, a system that treated human beings as capital goods that could be shipped, inventoried, and worked to death, then replaced. The crop's processing timeline created the labor system's brutality. Portuguese planters brought the sugar and slavery model to Brazil in the 1530s. The Dutch refined the factory system during their brief occupation of northeastern Brazil in the 1600s, then exported the techniques to the Caribbean when Portugal reclaimed the territory. English and French colonists adopted the model on Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint-Domingue. By 1700, the Caribbean produced more sugar than all previous sources combined, and it did so by turning islands into industrial zones where enslaved Africans outnumbered Europeans 10-1. Each colonial power studied the other's plantation designs, copied the most profitable techniques, and competed to increase output. Sugar plantations became testing grounds for industrial management decades before factories appeared in European cities. The economics worked because sugar sold at volumes that luxuries never had. European demand exploded as prices dropped. Sugar moved from apothecary to coffeehouse to household staple. It sweetened tea, preserved fruit, and filled pastries, but it also became a calorie source for factory workers in Manchester and dock labourers in London, cheap fuel for populations that were leaving farms and entering wage labour. Caribbean plantations became factories in the field, running 24-hour boiling operations during harvest, coordinating shipping schedules, and maintaining constant output for European refineries. The same decade that saw the first textile mills in England saw Caribbean estates operating with shift rotations, output quotas, and continuous production schedules. Industrial capitalism didn't begin in Manchester, it began in the cane fields. To keep those plantations running, slave ships made approximately 35,000 voyages between 1500 and 1800. Ships left European ports with manufactured goods, traded them on the West African coast for captive people, transported those people across the Atlantic under conditions that killed 1 in 7, then returned to Europe carrying sugar, tobacco, and rum. The Atlantic slave trade became the largest forced migration in human history, and sugar was its primary economic driver. The crop didn't just participate in the slave trade, it required the slave trade to function at the scale Europeans demanded. Without continuous replacement of the enslaved workforce, the plantation system would have collapsed within a generation. The human cost was visible in mortality rates. Enslaved people on sugar plantations died faster than they reproduced. Planters calculated that it was cheaper to import new workers from Africa than to keep existing workers alive long enough to raise children. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar estate was 7 years from arrival. That wasn't an accident of climate or disease. It was a business model that treated human life as disposable and used the Atlantic slave trade as a continuous replacement system. Plantation account books recorded enslaved people alongside livestock and equipment, with depreciation schedules that assumed death and budgeted for replacement purchases. The system's efficiency depended on this calculus. The financial instruments that funded this system reshaped European banking. Insurance companies wrote policies on slave ship cargoes, treating human beings as insurable goods. Merchant banks in London, Amsterdam, and Bordeaux extended credit against future sugar harvests, creating the first commodity futures markets. Port cities grew wealthy processing sugar and financing voyages. Liverpool became Britain's second-largest city by 1790, almost entirely on slave trade profits and sugar refining. The wealth generated by Caribbean plantations funded country estates, parliamentary seats, and investment capital that would later build Britain's railway network. Sugar money didn't stay in the colonies. It flowed back to Europe and became the foundation of industrial financing. By the late 1700s, the system faced two sources of pressure. Abolitionist movements in Britain and France documented the violence, published slave narratives, and built political coalitions that forced legislative debates. At the same time, the Haitian Revolution demonstrated that enslaved populations could destroy the plantation system from within. Saint-Domingue had been the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean, producing nearly half the world's sugar and coffee by 1790. 13 years later, Haiti was an independent republic, and the plantation economy was gone. Britain outlawed the international slave trade in 1807, though slavery itself continued in British colonies until 1833. The United States banned importation in 1808, but maintained domestic slavery until 1865. Brazil and Cuba, the last major slave societies in the Americas, didn't abolish slavery until 1888 and 1886. The end of legal slavery didn't end coerced labor in sugar production. British Caribbean plantations transitioned to indentured workers from India, transporting nearly 500,000 people under contracts that bound them for 5 to 10 years with minimal legal protection. The terms were different, but the economic logic was familiar. A workforce that couldn't leave, couldn't negotiate wages, and could be replaced from abroad when supply ran low. Sugar regions in Fiji, Mauritius, and Queensland built their labor forces the same way. The crop's processing demands still required a controlled workforce, and colonial administrators found legal structures that provided one without calling it slavery. Historians treat the end of the legal Atlantic slave trade as the conclusion of the Atlantic world as a distinct system, and the evidence supports that periodization. The integrated circuit of European manufactured goods, African captives, and American plantation products defined the system's structure from the Age of Discovery into the 19th century. What gave the Atlantic world coherence wasn't just geography or colonial competition. It was the economic engine that sugar provided, profitable enough to justify the ships, the financing networks, the insurance markets, and the legal frameworks that treated millions of people as tradable commodities. When international slave trade became illegal and plantation slavery ended in the 1880s, that particular configuration broke apart. What sugar revealed was that a food system could reorganize societies on 3 continents. It turned islands into monoculture zones, created financial instruments to fund slave ships, fed European workers cheaply enough to enable industrial wages, and made the forced transport of 11 million Africans economically rational within the logic of global trade. The Atlantic world wasn't just an era of exploration and colonial competition. It was a unified economic system, and sugar was the product that made the system cohere, profit, and perpetuate itself for 300 years. The sweetness came at a cost measured in millions of lives, and the wealth it generated built the financial infrastructure of the modern world. Visual reconstructions are illustrative. Facts and interpretations are based on the sources listed in the description.